Do you believe that happiness has a price tag? I, for one, whenever I receive money from birthdays, from a paycheck, or even a gift card of any sort, I tend to believe that that's when I feel really, really happy. Now, the reason why I feel that way is because I feel as though that I have purchasing power and I have the ability to get whatever I want, which I immediately assume leads to happiness. For me, feeling happy at one given point makes me believe that I have achieved happiness. And today, for today's speech, I like to talk about why people assume that the slogan, money equals happiness, is true. And I'd also like to tell my audience about why that slogan is in fact not true. To start some things off, for today's speech, I'll be going into detail about 3 main points. Point 1 strongly deals with Maslow's hierarchy of needs and how money does not fit into the categories that is required for Maslow's hierarchy. Point 2 is going to go ahead and talk about how money has intrinsic value, but also how it fails to provide us individuals with that feeling of intrinsic value. Third point is going to go ahead and talk about the definition of happiness and what it really entails. Now, going to my first point. According to Maslow, there are 5 distinct needs that humans need to have in order to really achieve happiness. While I could go on and talk about each of these needs individually, for today's speech I will specifically be discussing physical needs and self-esteem needs. Physical needs are things such as shelter, food, water, and in this case, money would be a perfect example that would fit in this category. Self-esteem needs, on the other hand, are needs that can be found within: a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging, and some kind of intrinsic value that we attach to ourselves. Now, these are just 2 simple categories that are needed in order to achieve Maslow's hierarchy. However, with money alone, money fails to fit into the self-esteem category of needs, simply because it has intrinsic value in of itself, but it fails to provide that intrinsic value towards other things. For an example, if a very rich and fortunate person were to have a lot of money, very few people who are rich would prefer to be defined just as someone who is rich. When they're introduced to a group of people, they like to be described for who they are within. What makes them the person that they are? What makes them fun to be around? What's a good trait that would describe them? These are all things that people would choose to be described over the word rich. Now, moving on to my second point, I'd like to talk about how money does not actually provide individuals with intrinsic value. While money itself has a lot of value, we use it in our markets, we use it in our economy, and we're able to have a lot of purchasing power with it, it doesn't suddenly translate that we ourselves feel intrinsic value. I could have a dollar bill, but just because I have $1 bill doesn't suddenly mean the image of myself becomes better. A better example of this would be comparing family versus money. If someone who had a lot of money, but also a lot of family, were asked to choose to give up one, most individuals would choose money. And most individuals would choose something that would make them happy. Money has an intrinsic value, but money fails to actually convey an intrinsic worth or value to yourself. Whereas family also has a lot of intrinsic value, but they're able to tell you and they're able to convey to you that you also have something within you that is worth of value. So simply put, owning money and owning something of value does not always attach to yourself and does not always equate to you feeling as though you have those self-esteem needs. So since owning money in of itself cannot be a self-esteem need or even fit into a self-esteem need, it alone cannot equate to happiness according to Maslow. Another important point to be brought up is our third point, about how happiness is usually incorrectly defined. Now, the slogan states that money equals happiness. While money can make people happy and it can make a lot of difficult issues disappear for most folks, it doesn't suddenly equate to happiness. When I get my paycheck or a birthday card or any kind of payment, I feel happy because I'm able to use that money and put it towards something that I would like. But that's really short-term happiness, and if anything, is strictly an emotion. Feeling happy at a given point in time does not always mean that someone is living a life of happiness. It's important to distinguish the two because one is discussed in a long-term manner while one is discussed in a short-term manner. Money, being low on the Maslow pyramid and only a physical need, would equate to someone being happy once they receive it. It's a physical thing that you would be happy receiving, but it's not something that owning would necessarily equate to you feeling a long-term state of happiness. Another thing to keep in mind is that long-term happiness usually ties to people having more pros than cons in their life. Let's look at someone who's very, very rich, for example. Someone who can be very, very rich does not always describe themselves as someone who is in a state of happiness in life. Let's say, for example, you have a lot of money, you have a lot of things that have inherently an intrinsic value, but that fails to tell you what your personal intrinsic value is. Comparing someone who has a lot of family with someone who has a lot of money, chances are the person who has a lot of family will more likely feel that state of happiness and discover that intrinsic value for themselves. This is why money can create the sense of being happy, but it fails to equate to happiness in of itself. Now that we've gone through all the three main points, I wanted to specifically discuss this slogan in hopes of changing the audience's view and values on the term of money. Right now in our society, things cost a lot of money, and a lot of people are quick to jump on the bandwagon that owning a lot of it suddenly equates to happiness. However, I think it's important to understand that these definitions should stand alone and should still remain within their own frames. Happiness should be a constant state of being in which pros outweigh cons, no matter of the situation that you are put in. And in a situation where you are put with a lot of family or other things that provide you with intrinsic worth, you are closer to being in a state of happiness than someone who is simply just rich. With this in mind, I hope you all remember that happiness in of itself does not have a price tag, and that happiness is a state that can be achieved through other Maslow needs. Thank you.